Getting a diagnosis isn't the magic key that you think it is. Before my kids were ever diagnosed, it was almost impossible to get any real support at school. And when we finally did get an autism diagnosis, I honestly thought that this is the point where the school is going to help, but that's not what happened. See, what I found out was just how much work a parent has to do to go from a diagnosis to actually getting the supports in place that the child needs. Getting the diagnosis was hard enough on its own, but turning that diagnosis into support was a completely different battle. And for us, that started the day that I walked out of the doctor's office with a diagnosis and straight to the school with the paperwork in hand.
And if we haven't met before, hi, I'm Alicia Trotwine. I am an autistic mom of 4 children, 3 who are also autistic. And around here, we talk about everything autism and the systems that we live within. So you're talking from schools to diagnosis to parenting to navigating life as an autistic adult. Now, I am an autism advocate, a speaker, and a writer. And everything that I share here comes from personal experience and conversations that I've had with families just like yours. So if you're ready for practical, easy to understand help along your autism journey, you're in the right place.
Before my kids were ever diagnosed with autism and ADHD, everything that the school did offer was surface level at best. I would bring up a concern and they'd be like, oh, well, they were tired today, or everyone develops their own pace. And honestly, that was pretty much the end of the conversation. See, no one was saying, hey, let's do an evaluation or let's look into special education eligibility. And there definitely wasn't any, here's the next step situations. It was always, well, we'll try a few things and see what happens. And it kept us in this gray area where nothing was documented and nothing really changed. When we finally got my child's diagnosis, it was a lot to process. See, on one hand, I was super frustrated. We had been seeing doctors for literal years without any real answers. I'm talking speech, occupational therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists. No answer. And it wasn't until my youngest child was diagnosed with autism that they even considered the older children. And at school, there had been years of me asking for supports. And it wasn't like my child was masking in that the school never saw it. No, they saw him falling asleep in class, struggling with his peers, dysregulated, and having meltdowns in the classroom. And with everything that we were seeing at home and at school, you'd think that there would be some type of support. So when that didn't happen, I started second guessing myself and worrying that I was just overreacting. But at the same time, when we got that diagnosis, it was a huge relief. I finally had the language that matched what we were seeing at home. And once I had that diagnosis in hand, I truly believed that the school would have to respond different. And what I didn't realize was that the diagnosis was just the starting point. The school still wasn't going to move unless I pushed and knew what to ask for. So here's how that played out. When we finally received that autism diagnosis, I left the doctor's office and headed straight to the school. I walked in, I gave him the paperwork from the doctor, I talked with the staff, and I asked for an IEP because we already knew he wasn't getting the support he needed. And at that point, I trusted that the school would take it from there. In my mind, they were the professionals, and they had seen my child struggling all along, so why wouldn't they do this? And to their credit, they did agree to test him, but it all happened on their timeline and through their very narrow lens of what the support would look like. See, they were mainly looking at whether or not he fit under the autism category for an IEP. They weren't really looking at any other options. And by time that they finished with all the testing, they denied his IEP. Now, they did offer him a 504 plan and told us that those accommodations would help him in the classroom. And at the time, I didn't know the legal difference between a 504 or an IEP or anything like that, so I assumed, well, that means that he's going to get the support he needs. I didn't know the language I needed to push back, or that I could have asked them to look at other options like emotional disturbance. And I definitely didn't know that most kids with autism do not qualify for an IEP under autism. So once we had that 504 in place, there were definitely some changes that were made that did help. He could go check in with a counselor whenever he was feeling overwhelmed. His seat was moved closer to the teacher. And he even got extra help with reading classes. They would pull him out with another group of students to help him learn to read. And as the year went on, other supports were added. I mean, when we noticed that hunger was a trigger, he was allowed to go down to the counselor's office. And in the moment, it looked like they were making the adjustments. But the day-to-day, things kept getting worse. You see, I was getting more phone calls from school. I would have the principal calling me to come up and help them get him under control because his meltdowns would be too severe for them to regulate. And these meltdowns were getting bigger and more frequent. And there was one point where my child, who was at the time relatively small for their age, had ended up under a desk, and I came in and I remember the principal being pouring with sweat and he pointing the other direction for me to go because my child had literally thrown a chair at him. So we're talking about a very severe meltdown. But just looking back, it's like, hey, how do we have all of these meltdowns and I'm asking for help and you're seeing the struggles and nothing's happening? But for us, the final straw actually happened right when I was kind of in the middle of learning IEP law. Figured out that I needed to learn more to understand IEPs. And there was this day that I got a call from the child's school, and it was a voicemail that's left, which never happens. I never get voicemails because I always answer my phone right away. But apparently, they had a substitute principal, and then they had a substitute teacher because his teacher was out sick, and then his principal and the counselor, which was a safe person, were off on a meeting. So everyone that was normally his safe people, they weren't there. And so that voicemail was letting me know to come pick up my child, something that had never happened because even though the school had been having me come up to help them, they were never saying, your child can't be here. We can't provide a safe place for a child. So this was the first time I got a voicemail or any type of conversation saying, hey, we can't handle your child. And that voicemail, it changed everything. When I put that voicemail together with all the documentation that I had of everything that's been going on and what I was learning about special education law, it gave me a clear paper trail that the school wasn't supporting my child. And that's what I used to finally force our hand to get my child an IEP. And at this point, I had literally gone to a seminar on special education law just to learn what it was I was missing because it was obvious that I was missing something. So I learned the hard way that schools don't just give services because a child has a diagnosis. See, they look for whether your child fits into a specific legal category and whether that they can show that there is an educational impact. And that's when it clicked for me. The diagnosis helped, but it wasn't enough on its own. Nothing changed until I understood the rules and started pushing. And once I understood the eligibility a little bit better, I stopped asking for extra help and made a formal request for special education evaluation. Now, I did this in writing, which is so key. We can talk about that in another video. But I put in writing his name, his date of birth, and a short description of why the evaluation was needed because getting on paper is what actually starts the IEP process. That's the legal part of it. Now, the evaluation process was still long and exhausting, but now they couldn't brush me off because I took the legal step and we were finally inside the IEP process instead of just circling around it. And looking back, my kid's diagnosis taught me way more about the schools than I honestly ever wanted to know. I had to learn terms like educational impact and emotional disturbance. At the same time, I was dealing with constant calls and constant meltdown because first, without the diagnosis, there was almost no path to real support. The school only started talking about formal plans after something was written down. And the second thing I learned was a diagnosis is powerful, but it's not a guarantee. We had autism, ADHD, and a list of other diagnoses on paper, a 504 plan, and obvious evidence that things weren't working. And the school still denied that first IEP. And the third thing that I learned is that parents are expected to navigate rules and categories that no one explains to us. And how much a diagnosis helps really depends heavily on the school. The same paperwork can mean completely different things depending on how willing your school is to act on it and what kind of support they actually have. Now, if you are still waiting on a diagnosis, most schools will barely touch support until there is a diagnosis sitting on file. But if you already have a diagnosis and nothing really changed at school, that's not on you either. See, most of the time, the school sticks it in a file, throws a couple small things at it, and stops there instead of doing a full evaluation. Because most parents don't know the legal steps to take. See, most of us end up having to figure this all out on our own, and we keep going back to ask for more than whatever it is that they offered us the first time. And you shouldn't have to do that just to get your kids basic support, but that is what a lot of us are stuck doing right now. And what I learned through all of this is that getting a diagnosis doesn't unlock the doors. Learning how the system works does. See, once I figured that out, everything started to change. I stopped waiting for the school to do the right thing, and I started asking for what they were required to do. See, the diagnosis, they gave me the language to describe what my child needed. But learning how to advocate gave me the tools to actually get those needs met. See, that mix of documentation and persistence is what finally opened the door to real support for my child. So now, when I meet other parents stuck in that same gap, the place between diagnosis and the help that still hasn't shown up, I tell them what I wish someone would have told me. You are your child's best advocate. The system, it wasn't built for our kids. But when we learn the rules, we can make it work for them. And see, that's what my kids' diagnosis really taught me about schools. They don't change just because of paperwork. Schools change when the people holding the paperwork learn how to fight for what that means. So in my next videos, I'm going to break down the practical sides of this. How to access an IEP, navigating diagnosis, navigating parenting of an autistic child, especially as a neurodivergent parent, and so much more of the systems that we have to live with it. So if you like information about that, definitely hit follow and let me know your biggest concerns you're facing in the comments below.